Hi, I'm Dr. Walter Matwaychuk, and what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about REBT. As many of you know, I am a psychologist and I was trained by the very well-known Albert Ellis. The goal of this video is to disseminate REBT, help explain it so that people can learn it on their own, or the people who consult with me in my practice can use this video to enhance their understanding and their consults with me. Now, there are several different core ideas of REBT that I'd like to talk with you today about. It can be explained in any number of ways, one of which is to explain what's called the ABC model, which is a very useful framework for understanding the relationship between events or adversity and our emotional reactions to events. And that's the traditional way of talking about REBT, talking about the basic attitudes and beliefs that have emotional consequences. And in REBT, we make the argument that what happens to you in life only gives you an opportunity to get upset, but that our basic attitude towards adversity is what largely leads to our emotional reactions. Now, REBT derives from philosophy, and Stoic philosophy among others, and one of the things that we distinguish between are what we call healthy and unhealthy negative emotions. So in life, when bad things happen, pandemics, for example, no one's going to be happy about them. However, some people may be very depressed by the presence of the inconvenience presented by social distancing, while other people might not be so happy and disappointed by having to cancel plans, graduations, vacations, work from home. People may be not so happy about that, disappointed or sad or concerned, but that's very different than depressed, anxious, and angry. So in REBT, the first thing we're going to try to do is talk to you about how it's very important that you understand that under certain conditions you can't be happy. What you can do is have a healthy attitude towards whatever inconveniences, losses, disapprovals, failures that occur, so that you have a healthy negative emotion. And the idea in REBT is to examine the basic attitudes when they lead us to unhealthy negative emotions, because these emotions tend to also co-occur with self-defeating behavior. And when we defeat ourselves, the idea in REBT is to examine the attitudes that lead to these self-defeating, unhealthy emotions and behaviors, modify the basic attitudes, transform our emotion into a healthy emotion, which then leads to self-helping behavior which we can then use to change what we can change about the adversity at hand. So in REBT, we're going to say, first, identify whether or not, given the circumstances you find yourself in, are you experiencing a healthy emotional reaction, even if it's negative, or an unhealthy emotional reaction? And usually the best way to make this distinction is by looking at the behavioral response that you engage in. Because if you are coping, if you're coping effectively, there's a good chance you're having a healthy negative emotion. If, on the other hand, you're avoiding dealing with a problem, or if you are being aggressive in some way or impulsive, it may very well be that you're experiencing an unhealthy negative emotion. In future videos, I'll go over this in different ways because there are many different nuances, but the purpose of today's video is to move towards a slightly alternative way of explaining REBT that involves emphasizing acceptance. But before we get here, first let me say one other thing. In rational emotive behavior therapy, we argue that at the core of emotional disturbance are rigid attitudes. Now, people are capable of holding both flexible attitudes and rigid attitudes. And the flexible component of an attitude is very healthy and will produce these healthy negative emotions when conditions at point A are negative. So for example, let's assume that given the pandemic, you have a vacation planned. It's the case with me. I had a vacation planned to Italy, and it was a 10-day vacation aimed at celebrating two big birthdays, my own, my 60th birthday, and my wife's. And unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we're not going to go to Italy. Now, we start off with a flexible wish or a want. I wish that our plans had not been interrupted or sidetracked or blocked by the presence of the pandemic. And that attitude will lead to a healthy negative emotion of disappointment as we think about going, as the date of the day we would typically leave on approaches. And that emotion can't be avoided. It's disappointing. We had planned to go and we can't go. We wish we could go. We would like to be going. We'd prefer to be going rather than staying home, engaging in social distancing. On the other hand, people tend to take their wishes and their wants, their preferences, these flexible attitudes, and attach them to a rigid attitude. So if we were disturbing ourselves, we would be saying, not only do I want to be going to Italy, but I have to be going. That I wish the pandemic weren't occurring, and it shouldn't be. It's interrupting my plans. Poor me. Now in REBT, what we argue is that the adversity at A doesn't produce the emotional disturbance, but that our rigid attitudes, our musts, do produce the emotional disturbance. They're largely responsible for our emotional upset. Get rid of the musts, no upset. What you have then is healthy negative emotions. There are three basic musts. Musts we put on ourselves. I must perform perfectly well. It's a must that can lead to anxiety, it can lead to depression, it can lead to shame. Then sometimes we'll put the must on other people. You must treat me nicely. You must treat me the way I think I deserve to be treated. Now, when you don't treat me as you must, then I could very well get angry or hurt if you're a loved one. Both self-defeating negative emotions. Sometimes we'll put the must on the conditions of life. So if I were depressed about the fact that I can't go to Italy due to the pandemic, I might hold an attitude like this. Pandemics shouldn't happen, and they absolutely must not, absolutely should not, must not undermine or interfere or block me in my vacation plans. So one can put in must, a rigid attitude, one can hold a rigid attitude on one of three foci. Ourselves, I must do perfectly well. On other people, you must treat me as I think I deserve to be treated. And life conditions, life, the hand of fate, however you want to depict it, must be the way I want conditions to be. Now, what we're going to argue in REBT is that you need to identify these rigid attitudes and then question them. There are two basic ways to question attitudes. One is to question the functional utility of an attitude. In other words, does the attitude work in the real world? In REBT, we define rational attitudes as attitudes that help us get more of what we want all things considered, and less of what we don't want, given the conditions that we face. So rational attitudes are defined from a performance standpoint. Do they work? Do they help us cope? Do they help us function in a difficult set of circumstances? The other way we can attack an attitude is by looking at whether or not it's true, whether there's evidence that we can observe or point to that supports it. In the case of, if I were to have the attitude, I want to go to Italy without anything undermining my effort to get there, and I stopped there, there would be functional utility to that. I would have a desire, that desire would cause me to make plans, and I would go. Also, it would be true, because I could point to the evidence that the evidence for supporting the desire exists within me. It's where I want to go to celebrate a birthday. On the other hand, if I escalate my want, which is what most people do when they disturb themselves, they say, I want to be able to go to Italy and I have to be able to go. I must not be blocked in my pursuit of my pleasure. I must not experience this deprivation that the pandemic is forcing upon me. Then I'm going to disturb myself. I might be angry. I might be depressed in a self-pitying sort of way. And that we're going to examine from the standpoint, well, does saying that reality must be different than it is, what's the impact of that? What's the functional utility? What's the functional impairment that occurs? Well, if reality's not going to change, pandemic's not listening to me, it's not going to go away, well, the consequence of, the functional consequence of the attitude is that I get depressed. Now that doesn't help me live well under the current circumstances. So that's one reason why we'd want to give up the must, relinquish it. We can look at the evidence. The evidence is, well, is it true that reality must be to my liking? Well, what is the evidence? The evidence is reality isn't to my liking. It's blocking me from going on vacation. That's evidence of what? It's evidence that my must is not consistent with reality. Things don't have to be the way I want them to be. Reality doesn't have to be the way I want it to be. So saying to myself that, or holding the attitude that reality must be a certain way, is inconsistent with reality. Excuse me. Yes, the attitude is inconsistent with reality. So what we're going to suggest is that I relinquish the must and hold on to a healthy attitude. What would that be? Well, that's true and functional. That's consistent with the available data. Well, I wish that the pandemic didn't exist, but sadly it does, and it doesn't mean it absolutely must not exist. I wish that the pandemic didn't exist and wasn't keeping me from my vacation, but it doesn't follow it must not exist. Now the second part, the negation of my rigid attitude, is very important. Because if I don't negate my rigid attitude, I could very well escalate the healthy part of the attitude from I want to go on vacation and escalate to I have to. I must not be blocked. So by putting in the negation of the demand, I ensure that I will not slip back into a rigid attitude. I want to go on vacation, but it doesn't follow I must go on vacation. I wish the pandemic didn't exist, but sadly it does, and it doesn't mean that it must not. There's no evidence that it must not exist. I wish the pandemic didn't exist, but it does, and I wish I didn't. I wish it didn't exist, and I wish it wasn't keeping me from going on vacation. It doesn't follow that it must not exist. Now, in REBT, we talk a lot about acceptance, and what I'm going to argue is that when we have rigid musts, we can't accept ourselves, we can't accept other people, and we can't accept reality or life as it is. The flower of acceptance, the flowers of unconditional self-acceptance, unconditional other acceptance, and unconditional life acceptance can't grow in a garden of musts. So another way of understanding REBT is not only do we teach the ABC model and we teach people to have flexible attitudes, but the purpose of having flexible attitudes is so that we can accept conditions as they exist and change that which we can change. Now, think about this for a second. Acceptance is something that we do not teach people in our society. Instead, what we teach people is to change things. We have a very technological society. We engineer things such that we get the environment to be the way we want it to be, sometimes. So we can't engineer everything out, but we really work to change things to our liking. Now, we try to do that with ourselves. We have cosmetic surgery. We try to make aspects of our physical features to our liking. We teach other people things. We yell at them and we try to get them to do things that we want them to do. Either in a healthy way we teach them, or in an unhealthy way we might yell at them. Both in an effort to kind of get the conditions of life to be the way we want. Or in this case, other people to do what we want. Or we may very well do things in life that tries to make the environment be to our liking, which is fine if you can do it. The problem in life is that changing aspects of ourselves, changing aspects of influencing other people, and changing aspects of life take time. Sometimes we can't do it. Sometimes it requires a great deal of effort, which makes it a good reason maybe not to do it. So one of the things that we want to have is a position of being capable of accepting what we can't change, or accepting what requires a lot of work. And so in REBT we talk a lot about acceptance. Now, we talk about acceptance from the standpoint of accepting ourselves. Self-acceptance in REBT means to acknowledge that you are an organism, a biological organism that's in a state of evolution, in a state of flux. And because you're in a state of change, you really can't statically rate or evaluate your human worth. It's invalid to do so. What you can do is rate what you do. So if you have a goal and you perform well, then what you've done has achieved the goal, you've done well. However, sometimes because you're human, you will perform poorly. And unfortunately, what people do is they get into a trap whereby they begin to accept themselves on conditions. I'll accept myself if I perform well. I have to perform well, and I'll only accept myself if I perform as I must. So you can see the relationship between musts and the opposite of self-acceptance, which would be conditional self-acceptance, which some people also call self-esteem. It's a conditional esteeming or rating of the self. And what we're going to argue in REBT, that sets us in an emotional roller coaster when we have conditional self-acceptance or conditional self-esteem. And what we're going to try to do is move you from conditionally accepting yourself to unconditionally accepting yourself as a fallible human. I accept myself. I'm in a state of change. I'm very complex. I have a lot of different aspects to myself. And the only thing I really can accurately rate is how I do in the context of my personal goals. Now, I also can rate, for example, a trait. So if you have a trait, such as the trait of working hard, you can say or having tolerance for things, you can say the trait is good. I don't really want to get into that now. Let's just leave it at that. What we're teaching in REBT is primarily that you rate parts of you or what you do, and that you accept yourself because, one, it's valid, and two, it works. So unconditional self-acceptance is something that we teach in REBT. Another thing we teach is unconditional other acceptance, whereby we teach people to rate aspects of other people or rate what they do, but not the person. Again, for the same reason why you wouldn't rate yourself as a person. You're in a state of evolution, you're complex, you have many parts, no one part speaks for the whole of you. Well, the same thing about other people. You can rate what they do quite validly. If a person breaks a law, kills somebody, they've done a very bad thing. Case closed. However, to go beyond that and say, well, they're a bad, evil person, is false to the facts. They've done a bad thing, yes, and we can talk about they're doing a bad thing and what we should do given that they've done that bad thing, but not need to label them a bad person. It doesn't really give us much more. So we can unconditionally accept them as a person, not rate them as a person, but rate what they've done. Same thing with life. We can argue that life is a very complex process, and usually it lasts for a number of years for most people, and